There are landscapes that hold their histories in plain sight, in the worn grooves of a ferry crossing, in the scorched stone of a furnace long cold, in the particular bend of a river where men once stood and recognized that geography itself had destined that ground for consequence. And there are places where three rivers meet, where the weight of water coming from different mountains and different directions assembles at a single point, and the very confluence seems to announce that something must happen here, that commerce and conflict and settlement and labor are not merely likely but inevitable. Such was the ground at the western end of Pennsylvania, where the Allegheny descended from the highlands of the north, and the Monongahela climbed from the coalfields of the south, and together they surrendered their individual characters to form the Ohio, that great corridor into the continent's vast interior. The people who came to this place across the century that is our subject, the Scots-Irish pioneers, the German craftsmen, the Irish canal diggers, the Welsh ironworkers, the freed people moving northward, found a landscape already dense with the memory of those who had preceded them, and they added their own layer to that accumulating record, year by quiet year, furnace by furnace, ridge by ridge, until the county they inhabited had become one of the most consequential industrial landscapes in the history of the Western world. Welcome to the American Gazetteer. Tonight, we turn the pages of history back to Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, the forge of the nation, as it labored and grew and transformed across the whole long arc of that remarkable century. Allegheny County occupied the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania, its boundaries drawn by the hand of nature, with a particularity that no surveyor's chain could have improved upon. The county's identity was inseparable from its rivers, and its rivers were three, a circumstance so geographically distinctive that residents and visitors alike spoke of the three rivers as a single institution, a natural fact as fixed and defining as the mountains to the east. The Allegheny River entered the county from the northeast, having gathered its waters from the ridges of Clarion, Forest, and Warren counties across a journey of considerable length. The Monongahela approached from the southeast, rising in the coalfields and wooded hollows of what would eventually become West Virginia, its current darker and slower than the Alleghenies, freighted with the silts of its longer passage through softer country. At the point, the precise western tip of the triangular peninsula formed by their respective approaches, these two rivers met and merged into the Ohio, which flowed broad and purposeful toward the Mississippi and the distant Gulf. The strategic significance of this confluence had been recognized by every party who had contested the interior of the continent. The French had built Fort Duquesne at the point in 1754, understanding that whoever controlled this junction controlled the commerce of the entire Ohio Valley. The British had expelled them and built the more formidable Fort Pitt upon the same ground. The American Republic had inherited the ground when the Revolution settled the matter of sovereignty, and the town of Pittsburgh had grown from the shelter of Fort Pitt's walls to become, by the century's opening, a settlement of several thousand souls whose future was being written in iron and coal and river traffic, rather than in the military strategies that had determined the location's initial importance. The county had been formally erected in 1788, carved from the older and far larger Westmoreland County, as population in the western reaches of Pennsylvania grew sufficient to justify separate administration. Its boundaries enclosed an area of approximately 730 square miles, a figure that placed it among the middling counties of the state in terms of raw extent, though in no other respect was it middling. The terrain within those boundaries was emphatically hilly, the land sculpted by glacial and riverine processes into a succession of ridges and hollows that made travel difficult in all seasons, and made the rivers themselves the preferred avenues of movement for goods and people alike. The soil of the county varied with the geology that underlay it. Along the river bottoms, particularly the broad flats of the Monongahela's lower reaches and the terraces of the Ohio's northern shore, the ground was deep and productive, its alluvial richness supporting the corn, wheat, and hay production that fed both the local population and the livestock trade, moving down the rivers toward the markets of the lower valley. On the ridges and uplands, the soil was thinner and the farming more arduous, though the same ground concealed beneath it the seams of bituminous coal that would ultimately determine the county's destiny far more than any agricultural consideration. The lesser waterways of the county deserve their portion of attention, for they shaped the settlement pattern of the interior townships as surely as the great rivers shaped the towns at the water's edge. Chardier's Creek descended from the ridges of Washington County to the south, entering the county and following a sinuous course northward before joining the Ohio several miles below Pittsburgh. Its valley was one of the earliest settled in the county. The Scots-Irish families who had pushed westward from the older settlements of eastern Pennsylvania, finding in its bottoms and adjacent hillsides a country that, while demanding, was capable of rewarding patient cultivation. The Anderson family, the Beelan family, and the Neville family were among those whose names appeared early in the county's records, and whose properties along the creek and its tributaries established the agricultural foundation upon which later development would build. Turtle Creek entered the county from the east, descending from the Chestnut Ridge through Westmoreland County, before joining the Monongahela not far from the town of Braddock's Field, the ground where General Braddock's army had met catastrophe in 1755, a defeat whose memory lingered in the place names and local histories of the region through every decade of the century that followed. The Wilkinsburg and Braddock's Field communities that developed along Turtle Creek's lower reaches were connected to the county's industrial future in ways that residents of the century's first decade could barely have predicted. The population of the county at the century's opening stood, according to the federal census of 1800, at approximately 15,000 souls, a modest figure that reflected the relative youth of organized settlement in the western Pennsylvania country, where the conclusion of hostilities with the native peoples of the Ohio Valley was still fresh in living memory. By 1850, that figure had grown to approximately 138,000, and by 1890, the population had surpassed 100,000 within Pittsburgh alone, with the county's total approaching 200,000. This growth, remarkable in its speed and scale, was driven by the convergence of navigable waterways, accessible coal, and the insatiable demand of an expanding nation for iron, glass, and all the manufactured goods that fire and mineral and human ingenuity could produce. The townships that surrounded Pittsburgh bore the marks of their origins in the names and characters that distinguished them through the century. Ross Township in the north, Pitt Township and Reserve Township on the river terraces, Indiana Township in the rolling uplands, Plum and Penn Townships to the east, Versailles and Elizabeth Townships along the Monongahela's southern reaches. Each of these communities maintained a character shaped by the particular mix of agricultural, industrial, and residential purposes that its geography and population had assigned to it. At the county's western edge, where the Ohio broadened between its bluffed banks and began in earnest its long descent toward the Mississippi, the village of Sewickley and the adjacent communities of Moon Township and Sewickley Township occupied ground of particular natural beauty. The high terraces above the Ohio offered views of that great river that visitors consistently described with admiration, and the combination of fertile bottomland and agreeable prospect made the Ohio's shores among the most desirable agricultural and residential locations in the entire county. The Shields family, the Ewing family, and the Denny family were among those who established themselves in this western portion, their farms and household accounts contributing to the quiet prosperity that characterized the Ohio Valley communities even as the industrial turmoil gathering at the point grew louder with each passing decade. The town of Pittsburgh, which served as the county seat and as the commercial and social center of the entire western Pennsylvania country, presented to the visitor of the century's early decades an appearance that combined considerable energy with conditions of considerable discomfort. Its streets had been laid out following the irregular logic of the peninsula's topography rather than according to any governing grid. The main streets followed the natural terraces above the rivers, and the cross streets ran up the slopes with a steepness that taxed horses and pedestrians alike. The ground was perpetually muddy in wet weather, the clay of the riverine terraces refusing to drain, and the smoke from the foundry furnaces and domestic hearths that burned the locally available bituminous coal settled over the town in a haze that visitors compared, sometimes admiringly and sometimes not, to the manufacturing districts of the English Midlands. The streets were nevertheless alive with the commerce that the rivers brought to the town's doors. On the Monongahela wharf and along the Allegheny's southern shore, flatboats and keelboats discharged and received goods with a ceaseless industry. The Pittsburgh merchant traded in goods flowing in both directions, raw materials coming downriver from the forests and farms of the upper valley, manufactured goods going downriver toward the settlements of Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. The O'Hara family, whose patriarch James O'Hara had built the county's first glass works, and was among the most energetic entrepreneurs of the period, maintained premises on the Monongahela waterfront that were among the most substantial in the town. The houses of Pittsburgh reflected both the ambitions and the constraints of a frontier commercial town that was rapidly outgrowing its origins. The earliest substantial dwellings were built of the red brick that local clay supported in abundance, their facades modest but solid, their proportions suggesting the federal style that had reached westward from the older cities of the seaboard. The Wilkins family, the Bingham family, and the Morrow family occupied townhouses of some pretension in the blocks near the courthouse square, their appointments speaking of commercial success achieved within the preceding generation. Behind and between these more ordered addresses lay the ordinary fabric of the working town, the boarding houses, the taverns, the small workshops of coopers and blacksmiths and saddlers, the log structures that survived from the settlement's earliest period, and the crowded quarters of the boatmen and laborers whose labor kept the wharves productive. The market house at Diamond Square, the name deriving from the irregular quadrilateral formed by the convergence of several streets near the center of the peninsula, served as the commercial and social heart of the community in the manner that market houses did in every American town of the period. On market days, farmers from the outlying townships brought their wagons into the square before dawn, their loads comprising the produce of their fields and the products of their households, butter and cheese from the Chardier's Valley farms, dried herbs and preserved fruits, poultry and eggs, bacon and lard, and the handcrafted items, wooden tools, woven baskets, homespun cloth that domestic industry continued to produce even as manufactured substitutes became increasingly available. The taverns of Pittsburgh occupied a social position of considerable importance in a community where long-distance travel was arduous. News arrived irregularly, and the social institutions of a more settled society had not yet achieved their full development. The tavern keeper, whose establishment might be simultaneously an inn, a post office, a meeting room, and a place of refreshment, occupied a position of social centrality that the church and the courthouse shared but did not displace. The Semple family ran an establishment near the courthouse that was known to travelers ascending from the south on the Braddock Road, and the Grant family's ferry crossing on the Monongahela served not only as a means of transportation, but as a gathering point where news from across the river was exchanged. The churches of Pittsburgh were fewer in the early decades than the earnestness of the town's predominantly Presbyterian Scots-Irish population might have suggested, their construction having awaited the relative stability that followed the cessation of frontier hostilities. The First Presbyterian Church, whose congregation traced its origins to the frontier settlement period, occupied a central position both literally and figuratively. Methodist and German Reformed congregations followed in the century's first 2 decades, their buildings modest at first and progressively more substantial as their memberships grew with the town's expanding population. Water was a matter of constant civic concern in a river town that was paradoxically poorly supplied with clean drinking water despite the abundance of water on every side. The rivers, subject to contamination from the town's own wastes, as well as from the effluents of industrial operations upstream, were not reliably safe for domestic consumption. The digging of wells in the town's lower areas encountered the water table at depths that ensured perpetual proximity to surface contamination. Springs on the hillside above the town provided some relief, and water carriers, men who filled barrels from the better springs and sold them by the bucketful through the streets, performed a trade that was as necessary as any other in the early town's domestic economy. The neighborhoods that grew beyond the original town limits as the decades advanced each acquired a character shaped by the industries and populations that settled them. The district of Allegheny, across the Allegheny River to the north, developed as a somewhat more orderly and spacious community, its grid streets and open squares reflecting a town planning effort that the older Pittsburgh had never quite managed. Lawrenceville, established along the Allegheny's south bank east of the town, became associated with the arsenal that the federal government constructed there, and with the industrial operations that the river's navigation invited. Birmingham, on the Monongahela's south shore, became a center of glass manufacture, its distinctive works lining the riverbank with their furnace buildings and the peculiar heat and glare that glass production required. The iron industry of Allegheny County did not arrive fully formed in the manner of some sudden industrial revelation. It grew gradually from small beginnings, its roots extending back to the charcoal forge operations that had preceded the county's formal organization and that continued in an altered form to supply the local demand for iron tools, hardware, and implements well into the century's second decade. The transformation from charcoal to coke, from small forge to blast furnace, from artisan production to industrial scale. This was a process that occupied the century's middle decades, and that drew its energy from the convergence of three gifts that the county's geology had arranged in extraordinary proximity. Bituminous coal from the hillside seams, iron ore brought downriver and later overland by rail from the ore beds of the Lake Superior region, and the limestone that lay in abundant exposures along the river valleys and served as the necessary flux in the furnace's chemical work. The earliest ironmasters of the county were men who combined the roles of entrepreneur, engineer, and laborer, in proportions that the later division of industrial function would entirely dissolve. Joseph McClurg, whose forge on Sawmill Run was among the county's earliest productive iron establishments, understood both the metallurgy of the work and the commercial logic of selling its products to the boat builders and tool users of the river trade. The Snowden family operated iron interests in the southern townships, their furnace supplying bar iron to the domestic market of western Pennsylvania and the downriver trade. The transition to coke-fueled blast furnace production represented the decisive technological shift that separated the craft-scale iron industry of the century's first half from the industrial-scale production that would define the second. Coke is produced by burning bituminous coal in airless ovens to drive off the volatile compounds and leave behind a nearly pure carbon fuel, burned at temperatures that charcoal could not achieve and could be produced in quantities that the county's forests, even in their considerable extent, could never have supplied. The introduction of the hot blast, whereby the air forced into the furnace was preheated before its introduction, dramatically reducing fuel consumption and increasing iron production per unit of time, followed from British practice and was adopted in the Pittsburgh district during the 1830s and 40s. The Lucy furnace, completed by the Carnegie interests in 1870, and the Isabella furnace at Etna, and the numerous blast furnaces that lined the banks of both the Monongahela and the Allegheny by mid-century, represented a scale of iron production that would have been inconceivable to the early ironmasters, who attended their small charcoal forges along Sawmill Run. The Hussey family, the Moorhead family, and the Graff family were among the iron masters of the middle decades, whose operations bridged the transition between craft and industrial production. Their names appearing in the county's commercial directories alongside the growing list of foundries, rolling mills, and nail-cut establishments that were reshaping the riverbanks of Allegheny County into something that earlier observers would have found simultaneously impressive and alarming. Glass manufacturing was an industry whose association with Pittsburgh began at nearly the same moment as iron, and its product was scarcely less significant to the county's commercial identity throughout the century. James O'Hara and Major Isaac Craig established the Pittsburgh Glass Works in 1797, the first successful glass manufactory west of the Allegheny Mountains, producing window glass and bottles whose sales supplied the entire western country at a time when bringing such fragile goods overland from eastern manufactories was both expensive and unreliable. The district of Birmingham on the Monongahela's south shore became the particular seat of the glass trade, its furnaces multiplying through the century to supply not only the immediate region but national and international markets. The craft of glassblowing required a particular combination of physical endurance and artistic skill that made its practitioners a community somewhat apart from other industrial workers. The Bryce family, the McKee family, and the Bakewell family were among those whose names were associated with glass establishments of significant size and reputation. Their products, tableware, bottles, pressed glass articles of considerable decorative ambition, being sold through merchants in Pittsburgh and shipped downriver to buyers as far south as New Orleans. The coal seams that underlay the hills of Allegheny County were worked from the earliest period of settlement, though the scale of extraction in the century's first decades was modest. Drifts driven into exposed hillside seams, their coal loaded into wagons or slid down wooden chutes to the river bank for loading onto boats. The men who worked these early drift mines were often farmers who supplemented their agricultural income with seasonal coal digging, the labor underground being cold and dark, but not, in the shallow workings of the period, as dangerous as the deeper shaft mining that later decades would require. The coal trade grew steadily through the first half of the century, as Pittsburgh's furnaces multiplied their demand, and the Monongahela's capacity to carry coal boats downriver to the market at New Orleans made the county's bituminous deposits commercially significant on a scale that extended well beyond local supply. The nail industry deserves particular notice among the county's industrial achievements, for it represented one of those moments when a single product achieved a dominance so complete as to define an era. Nail-cut establishments, in which sheet iron was fed through mechanized cutters to produce nails of uniform size far more rapidly than any hand-forging operation could accomplish, multiplied along Pittsburgh's riverfront through the century's first half, their products supplying the construction industry of the entire expanding republic. A house going up in Ohio, in Indiana, or in the Illinois prairie was held together by iron nails whose origin was almost certainly in an Allegheny County nail-cut works, their journey downriver on flatboats, and then overland by wagon representing the first link in a supply chain of continental reach. The completion of the Pennsylvania Main Line of public works, the elaborate system of canals, inclined planes, and rail sections that connected Philadelphia to Pittsburgh across the Allegheny Mountains, was an event of transforming consequence for Allegheny County. Though its announcement in 1834 was anticipated by years of planning and construction that had kept the county's attention fixed upon the eastern horizon. The challenge of connecting Pennsylvania's two great commercial cities had occupied the thinking of engineers and legislators since the early decades of the century, and the solution they devised was a marvel of ingenuity. A series of canals through the river valleys of the eastern part of the state, a crossing of the Allegheny Mountain Ridge by the famous Portage Railroad with its series of inclined planes, and a final canal section descending the Kanemaw and Kiskimitas valleys to join the Allegheny River at Freeport, whence boats could float the remaining distance to Pittsburgh. The construction of this system employed thousands of workers across a decade, among them the Irish laborers who had come to Pennsylvania in the wave of immigration that preceded the famine, men who worked with pick and shovel in conditions of considerable hardship along the towpaths and embankments of the canal sections. The Connors family, the Burke family, and the Flanagan family were among those whose heads appeared in the labor rolls of the canal contractors, their wages modest and their accommodations rough, yet the work itself connecting them to a permanent transformation of the state's geography. The arrival of the canal terminus at the Pittsburgh Basin, where the waters of the Pennsylvania Canal were carried across the Allegheny River on an aqueduct of remarkable engineering before descending to the basin on the Pittsburgh Peninsula's northern edge, transformed the character of the town's commerce almost immediately. Goods that had previously required weeks of overland travel from Philadelphia could now be shipped in days. Manufactured goods from the eastern cities flowed westward. Iron, glass, and coal moved eastward. The canal basin itself became one of the most active points of commercial exchange in the western country, its docks crowded with boats awaiting loading or unloading, its adjacent warehouses filled with the miscellaneous goods of a rapidly developing regional economy. The aqueduct by which the Pennsylvania Canal crossed the Allegheny River at Pittsburgh deserves particular notice as an engineering achievement. Supported on 7 stone piers rising from the river bottom, it carried a wooden trough filled with canal water from the north bank to the Pittsburgh Basin on the south, allowing loaded canal boats to cross the river without transshipment. The engineer who oversaw its construction, working through the practical problems of spanning a major navigable river with a water-filled structure, produced a result that was observed and admired by engineers and travelers from across the Republic. The railroad arrived in Allegheny County and began its inevitable displacement of the canal system with the relentlessness that characterized the locomotive's conquest of American transportation. The Pennsylvania Railroad, chartered in 1846 and pushing westward from Philadelphia with an energy that canal interests viewed with justified alarm, reached Pittsburgh in 1852. its iron rails completing a connection that was faster, more reliable, and ultimately cheaper than the canal and portage system. It was designed to supplement and would eventually supersede. The construction of the Pennsylvania Railroad through the mountain crossings east of Pittsburgh required engineering achievements that rivaled, and in some respects surpassed those of the canal system, the horseshoe curve at Altoona being the most celebrated example of a line that chose speed and gradient over the leisured counterfollowing of the canal. The locomotive works that the Pennsylvania Railroad established at its Pittsburgh division facilities, combined with the independent locomotive manufacturers that grew up in the county to supply the expanding national railroad network, added another layer to the county's already complex industrial character. The Moorhead Marshall firm and numerous other ironworking establishments converted their capabilities toward the production of locomotive components, rails, and the various iron articles that a growing railroad system consumed in extraordinary quantities. The bridges over the three rivers were among the county's most consequential pieces of infrastructure and among its most admired engineering works. The early crossings had been accomplished by ferry, the Grants Ferry on the Monongahela, the Davis Ferry on the Allegheny, whose flat-bottomed craft and their operators provided a service that was indispensable but limited by weather, season, and the capacity of a single boat. The construction of suspension bridges, first in wood and cable, then in iron and cable, across both the Allegheny and the Monongahela in the 1830s and 40s, transformed the accessibility of the north and south shores and enabled the development of communities that the ferry crossings had only imperfectly served. The Smithfield Street Bridge across the Monongahela, designed in its most enduring form by the engineer Gustav Lindenthal much later in the century, replaced a succession of earlier structures that had crossed the same channel, each representing the engineering confidence and the available materials of its particular moment. The act of crossing, which had once required patience, a favorable current, and a willing ferryman, became, with each successive bridge, more rapid, more reliable, and more thoroughly incorporated into the daily routine of county inhabitants whose lives required movement between the shores. The steamboat trade on the three rivers transformed Allegheny County's commercial geography in ways that the flatboat and keelboat era had anticipated but could not fully achieve. The first steamboats on the Ohio appeared in the second decade of the century, and by the 1820s and 30s, the Monongahela and Allegheny wharves at Pittsburgh were receiving and dispatching steamboat packets with a regularity that made river travel both commonplace and commercially indispensable. The larger packets, those bound for Cincinnati, Louisville, and New Orleans, loaded coal, iron, and glass at the Pittsburgh Landing, and descended the Ohio with cargoes that represented the industrial output of the entire county. The Pittsburgh Steam Engine Company and other local establishments became suppliers of the steam engines that powered the river fleet, adding another industry to the county's accumulating roster. The demographic history of Allegheny County across the long span of the century was a history of successive arrivals, each wave of newcomers reshaping the county's social and physical landscape while inheriting and adapting what the preceding waves had established. The Scots-Irish Presbyterians who had constituted the county's founding settler population were joined in the early decades by Pennsylvania Germans moving westward from the older settlements of Lancaster and York counties, men and women whose Lutheran and Reformed faith, whose careful husbandry, and whose skill in the mechanic arts added a distinct dimension to the county's social character. The Germans who came directly from the Old Country began arriving in significant numbers in the 1820s and 30s, settling initially in the area across the Allegheny River that would become the city of Allegheny, and spreading through the decades into the eastern townships and the river communities that offered employment in trade, craft, and eventually industrial labor. The Hines family, whose younger generation would eventually achieve national prominence in the food preservation industry, arrived in the county in the mid-century period, establishing themselves in the Sharpsburg and Lawrenceville communities. The Frick family, the Schönberger family, and the Vollmer family were among those German households whose names appeared in the county's church registers and commercial records through the century's middle and later decades. The Irish immigrants who reached Allegheny County in the earlier decades, many of them the canal diggers whose labor had built the waterways that sustained the county's commerce, settled in the working neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, in the 6th Ward and the Strip District along the Allegheny's south bank, and in the satellite communities of Lawrenceville and Millvale. They were in their great majority Catholic, and the establishment of Catholic parishes, St. Patrick's, St. Paul's, the various ethnic parishes that multiplied through the county as the century advanced, provided both the spiritual anchor and the social institution around which immigrant community life organized itself. The Murphy family, the Gallagher family, and the Quinn family appeared with particular frequency in the records of the county's Irish Catholic parishes. The Great Famine migration of the later 1840s intensified the Irish presence in the county enormously, bringing newcomers whose poverty was more extreme and whose disruption of settlement more traumatic than those who had preceded them. These later arrivals found employment in the foundries, the rolling mills, and the coal workings, their wages modest and their conditions often arduous, yet the county's expanding industrial economy provided work in quantities that no other American region could readily match. The contrast between the destitution from which they had fled and the smoky, exhausting, but remunerative labor that the Pittsburgh district offered was, for many, precisely sufficient to justify the crossing. If you find yourself listening to these words tonight, perhaps in some corner of the world that bears no resemblance to the river valleys we describe, perhaps in a house that knows nothing of coal smoke or the sound of a hammer on iron, consider that the history assembled here belongs equally to all who care to receive it. The families whose names these pages record, the workers who bent over forge and canal lock and glass furnace, the women who tended households in the smoke-dimmed air of the Three River country, they are the common inheritance of those who pause to listen. If these quiet chronicles offer you the companionship of history in the hours of rest, we invite you to remain with us, to mark yourself as a keeper of this ongoing record of American memory, so that these lives may be preserved against the forgetting that time brings to all things. The Welsh ironworkers who came to Allegheny County in the century's middle decades brought with them skills in the puddling and rolling of iron that had been developed in the Welsh iron districts of Merthyr Tydfil and Dowlais. These men, whose names, Price and Morgan and Jones and Davies, had already appeared in the county's earlier records through the Pennsylvania Dutch migrations, were recruited by the county's ironmasters for their particular technical knowledge at a time when the transition from cast to wrought iron production was demanding skills that locally trained workers had not yet fully mastered. They settled principally in Lawrenceville, in parts of the South Side, and in the communities along the Monongahela's south bank, establishing Welsh Calvinist and Welsh Congregational churches, whose plain but earnest worship maintained the linguistic and religious character of the Welsh tradition. The African-American community of Allegheny County, while smaller than that of Philadelphia, was present and organized from the century's earliest decades. Pittsburgh lay at the end of several routes that freedom-seeking individuals had followed northward from the border states of Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky, and both the county's black community and a portion of its white community, particularly among the Quakers who had settled in the quieter townships, participated actively in facilitating safe passage. The Bethel AME Church in Pittsburgh, the African Methodist Episcopal Church of Allegheny, and the various mutual aid societies organized by the county's black residents served as both spiritual institutions and community anchors in a city where legal freedom was not always accompanied by social equality. The tensions that population growth and ethnic diversity inevitably produced were felt throughout the county's social geography. The nativist disturbances that visited other American cities during the 1840s had echoes in Pittsburgh, where the rapid growth of the Catholic population and the perceived competition for employment in the trades generated hostility from those who had established prior claim to the county's occupational landscape. The volunteer fire companies, institutions that combined genuine community service with considerable social and sometimes political ambition, became in several instances organizational bases for ethnic and sectional conflict that spilled into the streets during periods of particular tension. The Germans and Irish each brought to the county not only their labor, but their cultural traditions, their organizational habits, and their characteristic approaches to the pleasures and consolations of life. The German singing societies, Männerchor, whose members gathered on weekday evenings to rehearse the choral repertoire that had followed them from the Rhine and the Elbe, and the Irish fraternal organizations, each created within the broader county, a particular kind of social space, defined by common origin and mutual obligation, that served the practical function of community solidarity, as well as the emotional function of preserving what had been left behind. The Allegheny Arsenal, established at Lawrenceville in 1814 on a broad plateau above the Allegheny River, became an important employer in that community and a regular presence in the consciousness of the county's residents throughout the century. The arsenal manufactured and stored military ordnance, and its civilian workforce, including many women in the cartridge-filling operations, contributed to the modest prosperity of the Lawrenceville neighborhood, whose character the arsenal's presence helped to establish. The McClelland family, the Heron family, and the Murray family were among those whose household heads found steady employment within the arsenal's stone-walled precincts. The civic and educational institutions of Allegheny County grew from modest origins in the century's first decades to a condition of considerable richness and diversity by its later years. Their development reflecting both the growing wealth of an industrializing community and the persistent conviction of that community's founding Scots-Irish Presbyterian population that learning and faith were inseparable from the good life. Western University of Pennsylvania, established by charter in 1819, tracing its origins to the Pittsburgh Academy that had been organized even before the county's formal erection, occupied a position in the county's educational landscape analogous to that of the older Eastern colleges. Its curriculum oriented toward the classical learning that Scots-Irish Presbyterianism associated with ministerial and professional education. The Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, later Western Theological Seminary, founded in 1827 by the Presbyterian Synod of Pittsburgh, served as the training ground for the Presbyterian clergy who would staff the churches of Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the territories beyond. The Riddle family, the Hayes family, and the McGill family were among those associated with the seminary's early faculty and governance, their intellectual labors directed toward the formation of a ministry appropriate to the conditions of a frontier-to-industrial community where the consolations of faith were in frequent and urgent demand. The public school system of Allegheny County developed unevenly through the earlier decades, its progress reflecting the competing claims of local taxation, religious conviction, and the practical difficulty of providing schooling in a rapidly growing urban community where children's labor had economic value that education competed against. The Common School Act of 1834, which established a framework for public elementary education across Pennsylvania, was received in Pittsburgh and the county with mixed enthusiasm, welcomed by those who saw education as the foundation of Republican citizenship, resisted by those who objected to the taxation it required, or whose religious commitments led them to prefer sectarian schooling. By mid-century, the county's public school system had achieved a degree of organization and regularity that provided elementary instruction to a substantial portion of the county's children, though attendance remained irregular and the length of the school year modest by later standards. The grammar school on Fifth Avenue in Pittsburgh, the Allegheny Public Schools across the river, and the township schools scattered through the county's rural reaches each served populations that were becoming more diverse with each decade of immigration, their classrooms a microcosm of the ethnic mixture that the county's economy was assembling. Western Penitentiary, constructed at Allegheny on the north bank of the Ohio, near the city line, its completion in 1826 marking an important moment in the county's institutional development, represented, like its more famous counterpart, Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, the influence of the reform movement that sought to replace punishment's brutality with the more systematic intervention of enforced reflection and regulated labor. The building's design, following the radial cell block principle that had been refined at Eastern State, was set within a massive stone perimeter wall whose Gothic severity was intended to communicate both the seriousness of the state's authority and the possibility of the penitent's reformation. The Allegheny County Poor Farm and the various charitable institutions that the county's better-endowed citizens supported, the Pittsburgh Infirmary, the Orphan Asylum, the Female Charitable Society, formed a network of social provision that was uneven and often inadequate to the scale of need that an industrial city produced. But that represented a genuine effort to translate the reforming impulse into practical assistance. The Denny family, the Darlington family, and the Woods family were among those whose names appeared repeatedly in the subscription lists and trustee rolls of these institutions. The newspapers of Pittsburgh provided the county's inhabitants with a window onto both the local and the larger world that no other medium of the period could supply with comparable regularity. The Pittsburgh Gazette, founded in 1786, making it the first newspaper west of the Allegheny Mountains, maintained its publication throughout the century, its columns recording the county's daily life in a density of detail that has made it invaluable to subsequent historical inquiry. The Pittsburgh Post, the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and numerous shorter-lived publications competed for the attention and the subscription pennies of the county's literate population, their editorial positions varying from the staunchly Presbyterian conservatism of the Gazette's early decades to the more broadly democratic temper of the mid-century commercial press. The county's legal and political institutions were housed, through the earlier decades, in a modest courthouse on Grant Street that was eventually replaced by the monumental Allegheny County Courthouse and jail designed by Henry Hobson Richardson in the 1880s, a building of such architectural authority that its Romanesque revival bulk became the most admired civic structure in western Pennsylvania and one of the most celebrated public buildings in the nation. The law firms of the Stanton family, the Burke family, and the Carnahan family conducted the county's legal business through the earlier decades, their offices clustered near the courthouse in the manner that the legal profession preferred throughout the Republic. The medical institutions of the county developed in response to the particular health challenges of a rapidly industrializing population living at the confluence of rivers, whose water quality was persistently compromised by industrial and domestic wastes. Mercy Hospital, founded in 1847 by the Sisters of Mercy under Bishop Michael O'Connor, the first hospital in Pittsburgh proper, received patients from the city's working-class neighborhoods whose access to private medical care was limited or non-existent. Allegheny General Hospital followed some decades later on the north side, its establishment reflecting the growing recognition that the hospital was a public institution whose responsibilities extended to the poorest inhabitants of the county. The secession of the southern states in 1860 and the war that followed summoned Allegheny County to a response that was both immediate and, by the measure of the county's previous history, remarkable in its scale and completeness. Pittsburgh and the surrounding townships had been, through the preceding decades, a community whose commercial connections with the South, through the river trade, through the sale of iron goods and glass to southern markets, through the downstream movement of manufactured products to the cities of the lower Mississippi, had created economic ties that complicated the political clarity of the anti-slavery impulse. Yet when the crisis came and the call for volunteers went out, the county's response was swift and substantial. Its manufacturing capacity mobilized with a comprehensiveness that demonstrated how thoroughly the county's industrial base had become an instrument of national significance. The Pennsylvania volunteers recruited in Allegheny County served in regiments that bore the marks of their origin in their composition and character. The 77th Pennsylvania Infantry, recruited largely from the county's townships, the 14th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and numerous other organizations carried into the conflict the workers, farmers, and tradespeople of the Three River Country, the Laughlin family, the Graham family, and the Watson family among the hundreds of household names whose sons went south, and not all of whom returned. The county's industrial establishments were converted to war production with a speed that demonstrated both the flexibility of the Pittsburgh manufacturing community and the comprehensiveness of the federal government's material demands. The rolling mills that had produced rails and structural iron for the nation's railroads shifted their output toward iron plating for gunboats and field artillery. The foundries that had been producing stoves and machinery converted their capacity to shot and shell. The Allegheny Arsenal at Lawrenceville, which had been a manufacturer and storehouse of ordnance in peacetime, became, in wartime, one of the most active military supply establishments in the Union, its workforce expanding rapidly as the demand for cartridges, shells, and military equipment grew with each month of the conflict. The Arsenal disaster of September 17, 1862, on the same day as the terrible Battle of Antietam, though that awful coincidence was understood only afterward, claimed the lives of 78 workers, most of them young women employed in the cartridge-filling operations, when an explosion in one of the laboratories spread with catastrophic speed through the adjacent buildings. The names of those who perished, Kate Coy, Mary Nooney, Sarah Donahue, and 75 of their companions, were recorded in the county's newspapers and mourned by a community that understood the war's cost as extending well beyond the battlefield. The summer of 1863, which brought the Confederate cavalry raid of General John Hunt Morgan sweeping through southern Ohio and Indiana before its capture near the Pennsylvania border, produced considerable alarm in the county, though no Confederate force ultimately reached its soil. The defense committees organized by Pittsburgh citizens, the hasty fortifications thrown up on the South Side hills, and the departure of militia units for the Ohio border represented a community's sudden apprehension of a vulnerability that the confidence of industrial strength and geographic removal had previously obscured. The alarm passed, Morgan was captured, and the county returned to the rhythms of wartime production. Yet the memory of those anxious days colored the community's understanding of the war's proximity for all the months remaining. African American men from Allegheny County denied admission to the white volunteer regiments in the war's early period, organized and petitioned for the right to serve, their argument resting on the same principle of equal citizenship that had animated the anti-slavery cause. The 43rd United States Colored Infantry included men recruited from Pittsburgh and the surrounding county, their service representing both a practical contribution to the Union war effort and a statement about the terms on which they expected to return to civil life when the fighting was done. The post-war years brought to Allegheny County, as they did to every part of the victorious North, a complicated mixture of economic expansion and social difficulty. The veterans who returned, those who returned whole or nearly so, found a county transformed by 4 years of concentrated industrial production, its foundries and rolling mills operating at scales that the pre-war period had not achieved, and that the post-war demand for iron and eventually steel would sustain and extend. The Grand Army of the Republic established its posts throughout the county, the Allegheny County posts numbering among the most active in Pennsylvania, their membership providing both social solidarity and political influence to a generation that had earned whatever claim it made upon the public's gratitude. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 reached Pittsburgh with a violence that shocked the nation. When federal troops attempted to break the strike against the Pennsylvania Railroad, the confrontation escalated beyond anything that peacetime Pittsburgh had previously experienced. The burning of the railroad's roundhouse and facilities, the deaths of both soldiers and workers, and the days of disorder that followed left physical and psychological scars upon the county that the subsequent decades of prosperity only partially healed. The memory of what had occurred lodging itself in the collective understanding of what the relationship between labor and capital in an industrial county ultimately meant. The Soldiers' Monument erected in Allegheny County in the post-war decades, along with the smaller memorials placed in township squares and church cemeteries throughout the county's rural reaches, served as permanent acknowledgments of the debt that the living owed to the dead. These markers, whether the grand shaft of polished granite that stood in a city square or the modest marble tablet that recorded the names of a townships fallen in a country churchyard, inscribed upon the physical landscape of the county, a record of sacrifice that the ordinary passage of time could erode only slowly. In the final decades of the century, Allegheny County underwent a transformation of such speed and scale that those who had known the county in its earlier decades might reasonably have doubted that they stood in the same place. The transition from iron to steel, from the wrought and cast iron that had been the county's characteristic product through the middle decades, to the Bessemer and open hearth steel that became its signature contribution to the industrial civilization of the late century, was not merely a technical change in the nature of the metal produced. It was a reorganization of industrial capital, of labor relations, of the county's landscape, and of its position within the national and global economy on a scale that had no precedent in its previous experience. The Bessemer converter, a vessel shaped like an enormous upright pear, into the bottom of which a blast of cold air was forced through the liquid pig iron, burning off the carbon and impurities in a spectacular display of sparks and flame that witnesses invariably described with a combination of awe and apprehension, was adopted in the Pittsburgh district in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Edgar Thomson Steel Works at Braddock, constructed by the Carnegie interests beginning in 1875 and named in honor of the Pennsylvania Railroad's president, was the first plant in America designed from the outset for Bessemer steel production on a fully integrated, high-volume basis. The figure of Andrew Carnegie, who had arrived in Allegheny County from Scotland as a child of 12 in 1848, his father a handloom weaver displaced by the power loom, his mother a cobbler's daughter of considerable determination, is inseparable from the account of the county's industrial transformation in these later decades. Though the full dimensions of the Carnegie enterprises belong more properly to the century that followed than to the one under examination. Carnegie's early career as a telegraph messenger boy, railroad superintendent, and investor in oil, iron bridges, and sleeping car companies established the accumulation of capital and the network of commercial relationships that he directed in the 1870s and 80s toward the construction of the most efficient steel-making facilities in the world. The Carnegie Steel Company and the formidable partnership of Henry Clay Frick, who managed its coke operations in the Connellsville district south of the county, remade the physical landscape of the Monongahela Valley with a thoroughness that swept away the mixed agricultural and industrial character of communities that had persisted since the settlement era. The workers who poured the steel and managed the furnaces and operated the rolling trains of these vast establishments were drawn from a wider geographic and ethnic range than any previous generation of the county's industrial workers. The Welsh and Irish and German workers of the middle decades were joined by Hungarians from the villages of the Carpathian Basin, by Poles and Slovaks from the agricultural districts of Central Europe, by Italians from the Mezzogiorno, each ethnic community settling in the specific hollows and hillside neighborhoods adjacent to the mills where they found employment. The Homewood neighborhood, the Hazelwood neighborhood, and the communities strung along the Monongahela's south shore each developed a distinctive ethnic character determined by the particular timing and origin of its principal immigrant population. Homestead, a borough incorporated on the south bank of the Monongahela, several miles above Pittsburgh, became in the final decade of the century a name known across the world, though the knowledge was gained through tragedy rather than triumph. The Carnegie Steel Company's Homestead Works, which had been established through the acquisition of an earlier plant, and then expanded on the characteristic Carnegie principle of continuous reinvestment in the most modern and productive equipment, was the site in 1892 of the confrontation between the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers and the company's management that became the Homestead Strike, a battle in the most literal sense, with Pinkerton detective agents brought upriver on barges, and a community of workers and their families defending the mill approaches against their landing. The violence of those July days and the ultimate defeat of the Union after the Pennsylvania National Guard occupied the borough marked a turning point in the history of American industrial labor relations that extended well beyond the county's borders. The coke works of the Connellsville region to the south, which were integral to the county's steel-making capacity even though they lay outside its boundaries, drew workers from the county's labor supply while delivering their product by rail to the furnaces along the Monongahela. The Frick Coke Company's operations transformed the social geography of that adjoining region in ways that parallel in miniature the transformation that steel was simultaneously working upon Allegheny County itself. The beehive ovens and company towns of the Coke District, creating communities defined entirely by the industrial function they served. The material benefits that the steel industry's expansion produced were distributed with considerable unevenness, yet they were real, and they shaped the daily life of the county's inhabitants in ways that distinguished their circumstances from those of workers in less prosperous industrial regions. The wages paid to skilled steelworkers, the melters, the rollers, the heaters who commanded the critical positions in the production process, were among the highest in American manufacturing industry, enabling the construction of frame houses in the working neighborhoods that, modest by the standards of the mercantile class, represented a genuine material comfort compared with the tenements of the eastern cities. The Delaney family in Hazelwood, the Baronick family in Braddock, and the Koslowski family in McKeesport inhabited this improving working-class world, their savings accumulating in the savings institutions that the county's older banking community had established, their children attending the schools that the expanding public system was extending into the newer neighborhoods. The county's commercial and banking establishments grew in proportion to the industrial wealth that was accumulating along its river valleys. The Mellon family, Thomas Mellon, the Scots-Irish judge and entrepreneur who had arrived in the county from Ireland in 1819 as a child of 5, and his sons Andrew and Richard, who would eventually direct one of the great private banking fortunes in American history, conducted their banking and investment operations from premises on Smithfield Street that were modest in external appearance, but of extraordinary financial consequence to the county's industrial development. The First National Bank of Pittsburgh, the Second National Bank, and the several savings institutions that served the working population each contributed to the financial infrastructure that industrial expansion required. Within the houses of Allegheny County, in the log cabins of the upland townships that persisted through the century's earlier decades, in the modest brick and frame dwellings of the working-class urban neighborhoods, in the substantial townhouses of the prosperous merchants and ironmasters, and in the elegant country estates that the county's wealthiest families maintained on the hills above the river valleys, life proceeded according to rhythms that were shaped by the particular conditions of place as decisively as by the universal requirements of household management. The domestic day began in most households before first light. In the farmhouses of the county's outlying townships, Ross, Reserve, Indiana, the rolling terrain of the northern reaches, the farm wife was typically the first to rise, building the kitchen fire from the coals banked the night before, and setting the water to heat while she dressed and attended to the initial round of morning chores. The dairy operation, which most farm households maintained as a primary source of both domestic supply and marketable produce, demanded its attention before all else. The cows to be milked, the milk to be set for cream in the stone-floored cellar or spring house, the churning to be begun on those days when butter was the morning's purpose. In the river towns and industrial neighborhoods, the domestic day was keyed to the rhythms of the shift whistle rather than the movements of livestock and the angle of the sun. The furnace worker who turned out at 6 in the morning for the day shift and returned at 6 in the evening carried with him the particular exhaustion of labor conducted in extreme heat, and the household that received him organized its evening accordingly. The dinner ready, the children quieted, the household's demands modulated to the needs of a man whose work had been physically consuming. The noon dinner, the principal meal in most working households, was carried to the mill or foundry in the tin dinner pail that became so characteristic an emblem of the industrial worker's daily routine, the wife rising early to prepare it before her husband's departure. The food of Allegheny County's households reflected both the agricultural abundance of the county's farming districts and the particular tastes and traditions that its various ethnic populations had brought with them. The German households of Allegheny City maintained their traditions of sauerkraut, smoked meats, rye bread, and the various preserved preparations that German housewives had developed over generations for the management of a root cellar and the feeding of a large family through a long winter. The Scots-Irish households of the older townships continued to favor the oatmeal, the salt pork, and the corn preparations that had sustained their grandparents through the period of frontier settlement. The Irish households introduced the potato dishes that remained central to the cuisine of the immigrant generation, supplemented by whatever the American market provided at prices that a laborer's wages could support. Children's lives in Allegheny County varied enormously according to the material circumstances of their households, the neighborhood in which they were reared, and the decade of the century in which their childhood fell. In the prosperous households of the Fox Chapel and Sewickley areas, children attended private academies, traveled by carriage to visit relations, and grew up with access to books, musical instruments, and the various accoutrements of cultivated family life that their parents' wealth made available. In the working-class neighborhoods of Lawrenceville and the South Side, children were expected to contribute to the household from an early age, running errands, minding younger siblings, gathering coal that had fallen from the rail cars along the river sidings, and as they grew older, entering the mills, the glassworks, or the domestic service that provided the working family's necessary supplemental income. The neighborhoods of the county's river towns possessed a particular intensity of communal life that the physical arrangement of row houses and narrow streets promoted, and the common experience of industrial labor reinforced. Neighbors knew one another with a thoroughness that proximity and shared circumstance compelled. The Fleming family's circumstances known to the Rowan family next door with an intimacy that both sustained and constrained. The social scrutiny of the tight-packed street providing both support in difficulty and a certain relentless visibility that left little room for private failure. The seasons of the year imposed their own rhythm upon the county's household life. The agricultural townships and the industrial communities experiencing this rhythm in different but equally compelling ways. Summer in the river valleys was humid, and in the lower-lying neighborhoods, unhealthful, the combination of industrial effluents, inadequate sewage disposal, and river water of uncertain quality producing the periodic epidemics of cholera, and typhoid that visited the county through the century's middle decades with a regularity that public health efforts only gradually succeeded in reducing. Autumn was the season of the agricultural township's greatest abundance, the harvest completed, and the root cellar and smokehouse filled against winter. Winter descended upon the county with a severity that the hills intensified, the combination of cold and smoke, and the particular gray of a river valley in January, creating a season that tested the physical resources of the household with particular directness. The Sabbath in Allegheny County was observed with a seriousness that the county's Presbyterian heritage ensured, at least in the older and more established communities. The closing of commerce and the opening of church doors on the first day of the week created a weekly rhythm of rest and religious observance that the industrial calendar, with its demands for continuous furnace operation and its indifference to the liturgical calendar, only gradually and incompletely disturbed. The family gathered on Sunday evenings for the reading of Scripture, for the singing of the hymns that the Scottish Psalter and the Methodist hymn book provided, and for the particular quiet of a household relieved briefly of the week's demands. The leisure of the county's inhabitants, what leisure the schedule of industrial labor and domestic necessity permitted, found its expression in forms that reflected the particular culture of Western Pennsylvania with considerable fidelity. The Presbyterian churches sponsored lecture series and reading clubs that served the county's educated middle class. The German singing societies and Turnverein athletic associations continued through the later decades to provide their particular mixture of cultural maintenance, physical recreation, and communal solidarity to the German-descended population. The river itself offered fishing, swimming, and in the winter when the shallower tributaries froze, skating that attracted participants from every neighborhood within walking distance of the ice. To stand at the century's end and consider Allegheny County is to confront an inheritance of a particular and somewhat overwhelming kind. The county had entered the century as a community of perhaps 15,000 people, its economy balanced between the river commerce that the point's geography made inevitable and the agricultural husbandry of the surrounding townships, its society shaped by the Scots-Irish Presbyterianism of its founding settler generation, and by the frontier conditions that had not entirely receded from living memory. It concluded that century as one of the great industrial counties of the world, its mills, furnaces, and rolling trains producing a share of the steel output of the entire republic that no other single county could approach, its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands, its social complexity reflecting the immigration of peoples from a dozen nations and a score of distinct cultural traditions. The physical transformation of the county's landscape across the century had been correspondingly dramatic. The hills that had been forested to their summits when the century opened were now, in their lower reaches, terraced with the housing of industrial workers, and along the river banks themselves, lined with the mill buildings, furnace stacks, and associated industrial structures that had consumed whatever remained of the alluvial bottomlands. The rivers, once navigable by canoe and flatboat through clear water over gravel bars, were now brown and turbid year-round, their surfaces carrying coal dust and chemical effluent, and the wastes of a population of hundreds of thousands for whom the rivers served simultaneously as water supply and open sewer. A paradox that public health reformers were only beginning, at the century's close, to address with the systematic urgency it required. The great public buildings that the county's accumulated wealth had made possible were, by the century's end, among the finest in the nation. The Allegheny County Courthouse and Jail, completed in 1888 from the designs of Henry Hobson Richardson, whose death the previous year meant that he did not live to see his masterwork completed, stood as an achievement of civic architecture so authoritative and so distinctively expressive of the county's granite solidity that it became, and remains, the most admired building in western Pennsylvania. Richardson's massive Romanesque arches, his handling of the complex program of courthouse, jail, and bridge of size within a unified architectural composition, and his mastery of the rough-faced granite that was both the building's material and its moral statement. These qualities spoke of a public confidence in institutional permanence that the industrial wealth and civic energy of the late century had made available for architectural expression. The Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, its initial branch opened in 1886 in the Braddock community adjacent to the Edgar Thomson Works, and its main building in Oakland, completed in 1895 through Carnegie's munificent endowment, represented the philanthropic translation of industrial wealth into public cultural provision on a scale that few American cities of the period could approach. Carnegie's conviction that the public library was among the most powerful instruments of individual advancement available to a democratic society expressed itself in a gift of extraordinary magnitude. The library buildings of Allegheny County providing access to the literary and scientific knowledge of the world, to the children and grandchildren of the men and women who had worked his furnaces and rolled his steel. Schenley Park, given to the city of Pittsburgh in 1889 through the gift of Mary Croghan Schenley, who had inherited a vast tract of land in the Oakland district from her grandfather, General William Croghan, and who made the donation from her residence in London. Having never returned to Pittsburgh after her elopement at the age of 15 with a British officer, provided the county's industrial city with an open space of several hundred acres at a moment when the surrounding Oakland district was undergoing the educational and cultural development that would eventually make it the county's civic center. The Phipps Conservatory, erected in the park through the benefaction of Henry Phipps in 1893, added a botanical garden of considerable magnificence to the park's resources, its Victorian glasshouses containing plant collections that brought a kind of tropical extravagance to the middle of a coal-and-iron city. The labor movement that had its roots in the county's ironworking trades and had been tested and partially defeated in the Homestead conflict of 1892 persisted through the final decade, its organizations adapting to the conditions of an industrial economy that was growing in scale and complexity, even as it was reducing the autonomy of its skilled workers. The Amalgamated Association, the various craft unions that organized the building trades and the printing establishments, and the broader organizational efforts of the Knights of Labor, each represented attempts to establish terms of employment that acknowledged the workers' dignity and material need within a framework of industrial production that was otherwise indifferent to both. The Carey family, the Mullen family, and the Donnelly family were among those whose household heads served as Union officers and labor organizers through these difficult years, their efforts creating the organizational foundations upon which the labor movement of the following century would build. The ordinary lives of the century, the lives that filled no newspaper column and whose names appear only in the census ledgers and the parish registers and the gravestones of the county's older churchyards, were the lives that composed the actual substance of this history. The farm wife of Ross Township, who baked bread every Tuesday for 45 years, and whose knowledge of medicinal herbs was sought by every household on her road. The German-born glass cutter on the South Side, whose skill with the engraving wheel produced tableware of genuine beauty for the households of prosperous Pittsburgh, and whose descendants, in the generation that followed, would attend the public schools that Carnegie's library enriched and the university that the county's accumulated wealth sustained. The free black laborer who worked the Pittsburgh coal wharves through the Civil War decades, maintained his household in the Hill District, and saw his son enter a trade and his grandson enter a school that would have been beyond imagining in the year of his own birth. These lives were not marginal to the history of Allegheny County. They were its history. What persisted at the century's close, beneath the smoke and the noise and the relentless energy of an industrial economy that had remade the landscape of the Three River country beyond recognition, was a continuity of character that the county's inhabitants would have recognized as their own. The Scots-Irish Presbyterian seriousness about education and faith translated through the public school and the university into instruments of democratic advancement. The German immigrants' patient craftsmanship, applied now to the precision machinery of the steel mills, as it had once been applied to the glass furnace and the cabinet maker's bench. The Irish community's fierce loyalty to parish and neighborhood, its organizational habits now animating the labor movement as they had earlier animated the fire companies and the mutual aid societies. The African American community's stubborn insistence, against all the counterpressures that the city and the law and the economy applied, that its members possessed the full dignity of human beings and the full claims of American citizens. The rivers that had determined the county's location and shaped its history continued to move through their immemorial courses, indifferent to the industries that had grown along their banks and the cities that had risen at their confluence. The Allegheny descended from its northern highlands. The Monongahela climbed from its southern coalfields. At the point they merged and became the Ohio, and the Ohio flowed westward toward the continent's heart, carrying on its surface the freight of a century. The coal and the iron, the memory and the labor, the unnamed lives and the named ambitions of a county that had forged, from the meeting of three rivers, something that endured. And thus we close the entry for Allegheny County. Rest well.